Good morning to everybody who's joined us. Without too much, I guess, faffing, let's get straight into a bit of an introduction to loss and damage. And I think to really understand what loss and damage is about, we need to start with climate change impacts. So, of course, climate change results in a whole host of negative impacts, the main one being an increasing average global temperature due to emission of greenhouse gases. Now, we also have a whole lot of other issues. We have changes in our weather patterns and we have extreme weather events. And examples of these are drought, flooding, wildfires, cyclones. But in South Africa specifically, one of the main things we can expect as climate change ramps up is, for example, an increase in water stress. Now, this will affect agriculture. It affects communities that are relying on subsistence farming, as well as the incomes from food production. Overall, it affects our food systems. Flooding, for example, severely affects urban infrastructure. It will affect water, sanitation. It damages schools. It damages businesses. It overall has a very negative impact on municipal ability to deliver on services. Of course, this affects the most vulnerable, who are least equipped to access and restore basic services and necessities, meaning that they are least able to actually just restore a basic sense of dignity in their lives. And of course, we also need to consider the gendered impacts. These damages are felt intensely at the household level, where women are deeply affected as the main caregivers and very often the main income earners as well. So in a nutshell, what we need to understand before we get into loss and damage is that these climate impacts directly impact on our ability to realize basic human rights. And so we must approach and act with a sense of urgency in this regard. So what is loss and damage? Definitions are broad and quite often contested. Broader definitions relate loss and damage to the more severe climate impacts, or in a sense, perhaps to the recovery phase of climate impact, so almost before we can even get into adaptation. So this may include, for example, slow onset issues such as sea level rise, as well as sudden onset issues such as unpredictable and extreme weather events such as cyclones. A good example would be the flooding we have recently seen in Pakistan that has decimated the country, and even that we experienced in KZN just last year, and we are still I think, reeling from the impacts of those floods in terms of the damage and just the lack of ability to recover from that issue. However, some definitions prefer to more specifically relate loss and damage to the climate impacts to which it is not possible or close to impossible to recover from for various reasons. And this is especially focusing on what we call the least developed countries, largely those in the global south. So as I said, these definitions are contested, and I'm sure our panelists will get into it just now, but they are contested especially because there is a push from the least developed countries and various alliances within them to ensure accountability in the various policy commitments to mitigate, adapt, and recover from climate change impacts. So the current conversation of loss and damage seems to center around compensation, specifically financial compensation, and especially as the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage seems to focus more on research and dialogue rather than liability, compensation, or even reparation. So why is the conversation around loss and damage important? Well, so as I've said, climate finance for adaptation is very limited. The least developed countries that are least responsible for climate change are also most at risk. And so we need financial assistance in order to both mitigate, recover, and adapt. So now, despite having its own article in the Paris Agreement and its own mechanism in the UNFCCC, loss and damage doesn't have any dedicated financing stream as of yet. And currently, the least developed countries are very reliant on humanitarian aid to recover from extreme weather events. And this barely touches the surface of what's needed to recover and then adapt to prevent those severe impacts again. Now, if we take on a lot of debt to try and recover and adapt to climate change, this also affects us negatively, as the high debt hollows out the state capacity to respond to the climate crisis in other ways. So fundamentally, the conversation around loss and damage asks us to question the approach to both understanding climate impacts, who it affects, and their ability to recover, and it asks us to fundamentally question how we approach climate financing. climate financing cannot be a least effort approach if it is to be meaningful. And at this point, I will hand over to our panelists to give us deeper insight into these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lutia, for laying the groundwork for the conversation that we're going to be having today, giving us a little bit of context as we continue with this conversation. One of our panelists isn't with us yet, but I'm sure she'll be joining us. Hopefully she'll be joining us shortly, but we do have Tando and Prabhat in the room for now, and we'll start with them. A quick background on our panelists. Dr. Prabhat Upadhyaya, Senior Policy Analyst at the WWF South Africa, describes himself as an academic activist with an interdisciplinary background. My tongue got tied all over there, sorry. He has worked on climate and plastic pollution in India, South Africa, Sweden, and Germany for more than 15 years. Taking a governance perspective, Prabhat works at the interface of policy research and policy advocacy for advancing institutional responses to the climate crisis and plastic pollution. He holds a PhD from Linköping, please correct me, University, Sweden, an MBA in forestry management from the Indian Institute of Forest Management, and Prabhat is an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow and serves on the board of South African Climate Action Network and the journal Climate Action. Prabhat, opening words, loss and damage, please.
Thanks, Pato, and apologies for putting you into difficult space. And yeah, so loss and damage. I think we are now at a space where one can say that the conversation on loss and damage is getting serious. So if you look at the historical evolution of the concept, this is when the UNFCCC was being drafted in 1991. Vanuatu, on behalf of AOSIS, Alliance of Small Island States, had proposed an insurance scheme to provide financial resources to countries that were to be impacted by sea level rise. This proposal was rejected, and therefore the convention text of 1992 has no mention of loss and damage. But it appeared for the first time in the UN climate talks in 2007 as part of the Bali Action Plan. But it was only in 2013 that it started really gaining traction in the UN climate negotiations, when the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage to avert, minimize, and address. So there are three elements. First is avert, minimize, and then addressing the actual loss and damage what came into being. And I remember from 2013, the negotiations, that there's quite intense negotiations, last minute negotiations, and US holding ground on certain matters, but eventually the agreement was reached. Then we come to Paris Agreement, and developing countries agreed to include a goal to limit global warming of 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement. And Article 8 of the agreement refers to loss and damage. However, even then, there was tussle about the language. And in the accompanying decision, there was a text which stated that loss and damage does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. So that's the broad context in which we are talking, right? Then in the last COP, in COP26, a large coalition of climate vulnerable countries, they advocated to create a new finance facility or fund dedicated to loss and damage, separate from other existing funds. But this was again rejected. So now what we have right now is a 2-year Glasgow dialogue to discuss possible arrangement for loss and damage funding, and agree to operationalize and fund the Santiago network on loss and damage. But at this COP, I think what is really different than previous COPs is the evidence in terms of the climate impact is there for all to see. So it's, when you're talking of it's not an abstract. We're not talking in abstract about climate change. We're talking about real lives. We are talking about different kind of impact. So When you're talking of impact or losses, there can be two types of losses: economic losses and non-economic losses. Economic losses, they are primarily tangible, the damage to property or loss of lives, and how do we address that? So, for example, in Bangladesh, because of sea level rise, Bangladesh is big on salt farming, but because of these sea level rises and tidal waves, their salt farming is being affected, and now Bangladesh is being forced to import salt of all things, right? But when we talk of non-economic losses, there can be significant losses. For example, somebody might lose their family members. There's no way you can put a number on that. The threat of a country actually submerging because of sea level rise is unfortunately real. So that it will entail disappearance of culture and the way of living, right? Then the accompanying trauma that comes with the loss of life and property, and then the damage. So these are different kind of terminology and distinction between the kind of losses, and how do we factor that in? How do we operationalize? How do we make sure that we take into account that this is what we are losing, this is what we have lost, and this is the kind of things which is damaged, and how do we overcome that? As I mentioned that initially, that the question is about averting and addressing loss and damage also. So all those things. So in last 2 years, what we have seen is that the impact of climate change is now very visible in almost all countries, but more so it just so happens in developed countries. So if you look at Germany, floods in Germany, fires in Australia, fires in US, in Greece, but also I think the flood in Pakistan, I think that has really shook the countries, that a third of the country population, more than the population of Nepal, affected, roughly 30, affected by the floods, and just the sheer extent of it. That is this the future we are gearing up for? And if this is what the future looks like, then what are we going to do to address that the injustice that is perpetuated by the climate inaction is taken into account? And that's where loss and damage conversation is at the moment. The major demands, and I'll just here refer to the expectations that WWF has from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, is that COP27 should decide to establish a loss and damage finance facility under the Universal Financial Mechanism with a dedicated fund. And I think the dedicated fund part is important, because we don't want it to be merged with other funds, and then it gets the purpose of the fund gets diluted. It also needs to be an element of the new collective quantified goal. So we have been talking about $100 billion per annum for mitigation and adaptation. So that doesn't have any provision for loss and damage. It is for mitigation and adaptation, not for loss and damage. But when we're talking of finance, new collective quantified goal for future, the loss and damage should be an element of that, in addition to mitigation and adaptation finance. And then they need to have the full operationalization of Santiago network on loss and damage with dedicated funding and capacity needs to effectively implement its function. So I think those are the key priorities which we would like to see being delivered from COP27. But needless to say, this is a contentious issue, and a lot needs to happen. But it's imperative that this is addressed in this COP. Thanks, Pato, and we can take on questions later on.
Thank you so much for that, Prabhat. You talked about the sad, it's a rather sad situation that although loss and damage has been evidently needed, it's even becoming more evident. And the sad part of that is that evidence is loss of lives, it's loss of infrastructure, it's loss of livelihoods, bringing it back onto the continent. Currently, the floods that we're seeing in Nigeria that are happening right now as we speak, and all that will be lost from those floods. I'm going to pick up on some of the points that you shared a little bit later. Please note, in the last 30 minutes of our session, we're going to have a Q&A session. If there's any questions you have, please pop them into the Q&A box, and I'll ask them to our panelists. Alternatively, You could share them in the chat, or we will open the space up to some verbal comments a little later. Now over to Tando. Tando, you're with South African Climate Action Network. We know that the Climate Action Network International has played a big role within the civil society space in terms of putting loss and damage on the agenda, in terms of creating the noise and building the momentum around the loss and damage facility. Yeah, maybe you can, your opening words can maybe touch on all of that and all the work that's been done so far, or coordinated so far from your side. Tando?
Thank you, Pato. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. Yes, as you've mentioned, Pato, so we're quickly just about SACAN. SACAN is a network of around 20 civil society organizations, from big name organizations to your community-based organizations. All of us work together to kind of coordinate climate action in South Africa and also respond to that. And so, yeah, to the subject matter then, on loss and damage. So, you know, over the last 2 years, more specifically, I think work on loss and damage has ramped up quite considerably. And this includes from the CAN International side as well. If I start at COP26, really coming into COP26, our game plan was essentially to do a litmus test on where things stand with loss and damage. As you've heard from the previous speaker, it's been a long-standing issue that hasn't yet been resolved, although inroads are now being made. And so over the last few years, particularly as climate impacts have increased over the years, you know, the issue of loss and damage has always just been lurking in the background, but has been the one instrument within the UNFCCC regime that could really help to alleviate some of the injustices which have happened, particularly after extreme onset events, and then also to provide a way out, particularly for states to have an ability to be able to respond after devastations and rebuild, particularly. And so over the last 2-3 years, our strategy has been to looking at ways in which we could push particularly for the loss and damage finance facility, right? So this means that in the development of the loss and damage Santiago network on loss and damage, the WIM, Warsaw Implementation Mechanism, all of these mechanisms have, let's call them instruments rather, have been in place, but haven't yet led to tangible outcomes, at least that particularly the least developed nations, those most impacted by climate change, can have a recourse on. And so we pushed back on it. We did this through a litmus test at COP26 to find out how much we could get loss and damage discussed, what the appetite is for loss and damage finance facility. And we learned that there was definitely an appetite, particularly from some developing nations, not all, to engage on the issue. However, as was indicated previously as well, there are some sticky issues, let's call it that really make this subject matter a rather challenging one to be able to discuss. And then one of the things that we continue to do in the space is that in us now trying to get it on the agenda, particularly for COP27, is from last year through to this year, we've been engaging quite extensively with the various negotiators. So CAN International as a broad organization is 1,500 strong organizations in about 150 so countries. So you can imagine when all of us are kind of pulling in the same direction, right, from the respective country perspectives, that we're all engaging with the respective negotiators. We're all looking at the subject of loss and damage finance. Excuse me, we're looking at what are the different elements that could be, that could make up such a facility, and what could be the modalities in which a country can be able to claim from such a fund. These are the things that we've been kind of working on. And just yesterday, we released an updated statement or report rather, which looks at how the different mechanisms, or rather the mechanism itself, can have different components that make it up and then make it accessible specifically to mostly least developed countries. Now, moving towards COP27, what we've been able to achieve, and I'm saying we as a global community in the sense, particularly as CAN, is at the various political meetings which happened over the course of the year, right? So we're talking about your G7s, your United Nations General Assembly, your bond sessions and the like. All of these meetings are meetings wherein the agenda of COP gets discussed either in part or in its whole. And in those spaces, that's where we then get involved in engaging specifically with the negotiators, specifically with those who are interested in affected parties, including community level, including at a government level, as I said, negotiators, including even from a funder level, because a lot of those monies sometimes come outside of the state, right? And this is one of the issues that loss and damage finance seeks to achieve, is how do you then provide a mechanism where a state that is, that the state could tap into when its own resources have been exhausted. Again, we look at this example of Pakistan, we look at the examples of what's happening in KZN, we look at what's happening in Nigeria. If you ask yourself, how do those countries rebuild their economies, especially after COVID, right, where we know state coffers have been somewhat depleted. And so this is the work that continues to be ongoing. In South Africa, we continue to engage with the South African negotiators on the subject. What we're happy to say is that they also share the same view as us as CAN, both South Africa and internationally, in that they see the importance, particularly of loss and damage finance, the finance facility. They also see the importance of the Santiago network on loss and damage, specifically the operationalization thereof, because Santiago network provides, let's call it an institutional home for loss and damage, wherein this loss and damage finance facility could have a possible home as well, and all the necessary mechanisms to kind of determine how countries or parties that these can have access to that funding could be housed there. So yeah, maybe be guilty of talking quite a bit much on the subject, but let me pause it here and just to say that similarly to what are the points that WWF through Prabhat has mentioned, for us, what we're aiming to achieve at COP27 is definitely there needs to be a decision taken on loss and damage finance. Before that, there needs to be loss and damage on the COP27 agenda, which we're happy to say is on the provisional agenda. It needs to be finalized now for the final agenda. And then the last one is we also would want to see the operationalization of the Santiago network on loss and damage. Thanks, Pato.
Thanks, Tando. Thanks for bringing all of that context into us. It'll be very important for the conversation we're about to have. One of my questions was, do we need to establish a loss and damage finance facility? And I think you and Prabhat have made a very, very strong case for why it's necessary. I'm going to share a question now, but I want you to think about it. It'll be the next question, but not the one you'll answer now. What this facility would look like. So we currently have the Global Environment Facility. We've got the Green Climate Fund Facility. We've got Adaptation Fund. We've got Climate Investment Fund. How do you see this? How do you see the loss and damage finance facility playing out? But before we get back to that one, because that one is going to be a pretty detailed answer, what would this mean for South Africans? So far, we've been talking about it at a global scale. We're giving even global examples, but when we bring it back to South Africa, what would it mean for South Africans who, one, had to live through the KZN floods, South Africans who live in mining communities, South Africans who live in former mining communities, just South Africans who stay wherever they stay and have to commute back and forth to work every day. What would it mean for them? Is it not just, again, another thing of the CSOs, the climate people are making noise about something that we'll never actually see its impact in our day-to-day lives? Tando, would you like to go first, and then Prabhat?
Sure. So what does it mean for South Africans? Let's take it from a very, very practical perspective. Let's put someone back in KZN and say, let's say you're living in KZN, in any part of KZN which was affected by that flooding, right? What you most likely would have experienced is that if you're in the rural communities, you would have experienced runoff water. So the water, the flooding wasn't able to seep into the ground because extended droughts had hardened that soil, so water just runs off. So that means you've got an ability or a challenge, at least, with growing your foods, right? Because all of the crops that you were growing have now been uprooted because of that flooding. You weren't able to catch that water. Your home, depending on the materials that you use, is probably washed away. If you're looking at in the city centers, you're looking at, I mean, again, if we take the example of KZN, we saw the port, all the containers from the port were washed away, or most of them. We saw bridges were washed away. We saw road infrastructure torn down. We saw buildings also, at least parts of it were literally broken apart. It means when we're talking about it from a rebuilding now, questions around where do the resources come from to achieve a lot of the building, or rebuilding, at least for the various parts of any locality or economy. How does one get access to that funding? What are the instruments that are important for a person like myself, if my house washed away, to be able to get access to that funding? Is it that it's dependent on me approaching the state, or is it at the foregone conclusion that because I was impacted and I've encountered that impact, that my house will be rebuilt? These are the questions that the loss and damage finance, although in its broadest strokes, might not be able to respond to, but as it finds its domestication in South Africa, would need to be responded to. What this means is, should we have a loss and damage finance facility, it creates an opportunity where, particularly beyond the ambit of adaptation, where we've seen either slow onset or it's fast onset or rapid onset impacts, that then people have got a place to be able to say, look, these are the impacts or the damages that have happened in this particular locality as a result of X and Y reason. Therefore, they should be able to receive some kind of support. This probably be a state functional institution, and then through that be able to rebuild. There's a at the moment, and this is one of the things that very quickly emerged after the KZN debacle, or let's call it debacle, a flood, was the state coffers already been depleted because of COVID. KZN specifically had an equal, double depletion because of what happened in June 2021 as well. So the state, that province has no means to be able to pay for it, right? So what does it, the communities there then don't have a means to be able to say, there are specific institutions, here's a place to go to be able to help us rebuild. So a loss and damage finance facility brings some kind of solace, if you will, to say, should such impacts or incidents happen in future, because we know they're going to happen, right? That's what the IPCC tells us, is that over the next coming years, we're going to see increasing precipitation or decreased precipitation leading to drought in the case of decrease, and leading to flooding in the case of increases. We know that these things are going to happen. We now know that should we have such a facility, should such a thing happen, depending obviously on the funding that's available there, that there would be some pool of funding that is able to help rebuild whatever space, whether urban or peri-urban or rural community, to be able to weather the storm, as it were. It also kind of feeds into what could be done by loss and damage, but I want to make the point explicit that the monies that would need to be ring-fenced, if you will, for loss and damage would need to be in addition to the monies that have been earmarked for what's called mitigation, the monies ring-fenced for adaptation. Because if we then want to say the monies that has been ring-fenced for adaptation can also be used for loss and damage, we're reducing the monies that are needed for an already underfunded adaptation interventions and responses, both in South Africa and globally. But you're also diminishing the ability for loss and damage as well to really provide the kind of resource response that it needs to provide in a situation where the state or community is needing it in order to rebuild whatever infrastructure has been damaged. Thanks. Let me leave it here for now.
Thanks, Tando. Prabhat, what would it look like for South Africans?
I think it's not just for South Africans, but for any citizen anywhere, right? So maybe depending on what kind of impact is being felt in that country, the response might look different, right? So if it's a flood impact, if it's, for example, Durban with significant floods, then the response would be different compared to say there has been droughts for a long time. So there is the time scale, whether it's a short-term impact because of sudden increase in rainfall, or the long-term impact because of 3 years or 4 years of drought. So compare the response that you need to see in say situation like when we had threat of day zero in Cape Town, then that response will be different from the response you see in Durban. So I think it has to be localized in that sense. So it brings to the question that, when you're talking of loss and damage, we are essentially talking of a 3-level response. The first, and the conversation right now is at level 1 and level 3, right? So level 1 is sort of, if I can put it that way, the international discourse, where we are discussing that, that we need to do something about the climate impact that is being felt on the ground. And that is the negotiation of what is being under negotiations, and that is being deliberated upon. Then the third one is where actually the impacts are being felt. That's the local, ground realities. And I think that then the middle is national, which will have to then will have the responsibility to establish that what is being felt on the ground in the local is a result of climate change. I think that might be one thing that the national will have to play, because if you want to claim the support from loss and damage, you'll have to build a strong case that this is actually what we are seeing on the ground is because of climate change. And so the response has to be driven through loss and damage fund or mechanism or facility, whatever, right? So that's it. And then it will bring, so maybe I'm talking from a governance perspective, but I'll come to what it means for South Africans from here. Then the question of accessibility will become important. That how quickly can you access this response? So if you are affected by flood, you can't wait for an year for international process to take its own sweet time. So I think the national response has to be there, but to deliver it on scale and to we need it to be supplemented by loss and damage. So in that sense, what it would mean for South Africans, at the individual level, people might even not care where the support is coming from, honestly. But if you want to deliver, if you want to address the questions of rebuilding at the scale, that's where loss and damage can come. So so when we're talking of loss and damage, we're in a way talking of 4 elements. The first one is the insurance part of it, right? So which is, do we have insurance for certain properties, or if the scale of insurance is so huge that insurance companies can't even process the scale of insurance, then that is where loss and damage can kick in. The second would be traditional humanitarian assistance, right? That's where the loss and damage could come in, and that might be felt at a very local level. That in provisioning of food, provisioning of water, day-to-day activities, etc. And then the third would be the rebuilding part of it. That an infrastructure has been damaged, you need to rebuild from the scratch, or you need to refurbish what has been damaged. So those are the 3 elements where the state or the national would need to play sort of an interface between international and local. However, the fourth part, and which becomes much more important, is what happens when the whole country gets impacted. I mean, Pakistan is not a small country. If 1/3 of Pakistan is impacted at any given time, which means that there can be instances where with countries which are smaller than Pakistan might be fully impacted by one particular event, in which case it may raise a question of migration and relocation of people who are permanently affected, displaced by climate change. So so that's where the loss and damage would come in handy. That fund would come in handy, and or diversifying the skills. Certain kind of employment might not be relevant anymore. So how do you make sure that the skilled or unskilled labor is now ready for a new kind of future? So I think what it would mean for South Africans would vary from place to place, but it would also vary from what kind of impact, the scale of the impact, and what kind of damage we are seeing, loss and damage we are seeing. So it's very, in that sense, dynamic in a very negative way, that we can't really predict that how bad it will look. We can only look at the broad trend that the climate impacts are being felt. But then I think there is an opportunity in the sense that we can learn from other countries' experience, that how are they mobilizing, how have they been promptly able to access loss and damage. But I think that even discussing about that, we are, I think, 2-3 steps ahead of the conversation right now, because right now we are still at the stage where we are saying, let's have this finance facility and let's get some modicum of like some resources flowing in. At the moment, we don't have the finance facility, we don't have that fund, we don't have the funding dedicated to it. So we are talking in abstractions. So it might only mean that we get to see the real loss and damage function. At the earliest, we might only see it in 3 years, if I'm being optimistic. But in the meantime, we will have to think of the national level, we'll have to drive the action, but that creates incentive to address this issue in the negotiations because the evidence is mounting. Thanks, Swati.
Thanks, Prabhat. You touched on governance and you apologized for mentioning governance, but thank you for bringing that into context because it helps us appreciate the structures and systems that not only make this facility come to life, but once it comes to life, what it would look like, at what different levels would it look like, and what that would mean for it actually now having an impact on people's lives. And when you talked about the impact that it's had on bigger countries, I think we're already seeing how properly devastating it can be for smaller countries. We're seeing this mostly in island states who are the first ones to make the call for the loss and damage facility. So it's the reality is there, and thank you so much for bringing that into the conversation. Again, if you're joining us, if you've just joined us, good morning, you're welcome. The conversation is still going. I'd like to invite you to please share your questions in the Q&A box. Richard and Simpilo, your questions are noted and I'll ask them shortly. And then in the chat, please introduce yourself so we know who's in the room with us. Hello, Clive, and hi, Dineo. Simpilo, we see you. John and Sisu and Tanya, please do introduce yourselves so we know how many organizations we have in the room. We know how many people are part of the conversation, and also don't forget to share your questions. Now moving on to, actually before we continue, I just wanted to confirm, Ms. Ndivile, were you able to join us? Are you able to unmute? Are you with us? Okay, maybe she's not with us yet. So now South Africa's climate action and what they're doing towards addressing the climate crisis, a big part of it has been the just transition. Whenever South Africa talks climate change, we talk just transition because it's a thing of we need to respond in a just manner. What role then, where's the juxtaposition of the just transition and the loss and damage facility? Where do they meet and what do the two mean for each other? Prabhat, you can go first, and then Tando.
I think it partially addresses the question that Richard has raised about the equity principles. Look, one way of looking at just transition is we're talking about just transition in a way that to leave no one behind, right? That's the sort of a mantra in which the just transition debate is being held. That we are going to move away from fossil fuel, but in the transition, how do we ensure that those who are dependent on fossil, who benefit from fossil fuel economies are not left behind? So that's the conversation. The loss and damage is actually a realization and acceptance that in some way we may have instances where people will be left behind by the impact of climate change, right? People, culture, communities, cities. So what happens when that happens? When our efforts to realize a just transition are not sufficient, are not at pace with the impact of climate change, right? So I think that's where the loss and damage comes in. So it might not. So it's a next layer of conversation. So if you've been familiar with the climate space, we're talking of mitigation as the first line of defense. That we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If we can't reduce greenhouse gas emissions enough, then we need to adapt so that we can withstand the impact of climate change. And if you can't, if you haven't prioritized adaptation, then you're going to be face the burden of climate change. Then what do we do in that case? So I think this is the third and the final sort of line of defense, if I can put it that way, and that's where it comes in. So it's also about justice, but in a different way. It's about justice in the sense that while just transition is about how do you take everyone along, it's about justice in a way that, if we can't take everybody along, if people are being affected, how do we compensate them for the loss and damage that they are facing, which frankly they may not have any role to play in, right? For example, the emissions from South Africa or from any developing country might not be so high to have a significant impact in terms of climate change. But then who is responsible? So those questions come in. And I think then I can briefly touch on the question that Richard has raised, whether, the negotiation and proposals on loss and damage apply the equity principle. I think that is the elephant in the room, that from developing country perspective, these negotiations should recognize the equity principles explicitly. But the fact that developed countries are very cagey about the language of loss and damage to make sure that it's not seen as a call for repetitions or insurance, etc. So I think that underlines the tension that we are seeing, that equity principles for whom and to what extent. So that's the push and pull of the conversation. But I think now I see that I feel that because now the impact are being felt in developed countries, we might have a situation where we are talking of loss and damage for all countries. And there you might have a provision that those countries which are more affected by climate change may have a bigger claim. And in that case, a country which is geographically huge, like US, might be in a situation to claim more of the loss and damage fund. So, you giving fund from one hand and taking back from your other hand, right? So that becomes real. So in that case, the principles of equity, etc., they become important. That how do we make sure that a country like US, which has faced the impact of climate change, but we then can turn back and say, look, but you have resources in your other pocket to take care of yourself, and leave this one for those countries which haven't really contributed to climate change, and leave it. So in that sense, I think we still need to operationalize the equity principles and say who gets to have the first dib on, maybe not the right language, have access, whom will we prioritize giving the access to loss and damage fund. And I think that's a much more contentious issue. But I think if we look at the broader geopolitics and the turn of politics towards more realistic politics, which in the sense that each one for themselves, which we are seeing, I think we just have to be wary that any such fund can be used to serve one's own ends. Thanks.
Thanks, Prabhat. A couple of things that I'm going to come back to you on: the accessibility, the politics of loss and damage so far, and a few other points you brought up. But for now, Thando, the juxtaposition of loss and damage finance facility and just transition, where do they meet? And yeah.
So thanks, Pato. So for me, when we look at the subject of just transition vis-a-vis loss and damage finance specifically, the biggest consideration is that of time, right? And I think Prabhat alluded to it earlier. The just transition is happening, firstly, but it's happening over a longer period of time. For instance, South Africa's just transition plans extend to about 2050. Other countries beyond that, right? Whereas losses and damages are happening on a daily basis in some countries. So it's a question of where then is the justice if we're saying people experiencing impacts now, and those impacts are being felt more so by those who are the least responsible for climate change, but they're being felt the most and they're being felt right now. And they also have the ability to be able to respond depleted, right? Versus the longer term plans for just transition, where just transition says, in order to avert the crises, we need to then change our various systems. So it becomes a question of time. How then can we put in place something which can be able to respond to the very emergent needs that nations have vis-a-vis the longer term causes that can avert the crisis if we can address the root causes of what brought about both the losses and damages and the longer term climate changes. So it becomes a question of time, at least in my view. Now, it's not, I want to kind of touch on some things as well that Richard also asked in his question. Common but differentiated responsibility and the polluter pays principle are two, let's call them, criteria that were being proposed by the group of 77 in China last year at COP26, when they made a supplication to have a loss and damage finance facility. Quickly, what those two terms mean. CBDR and RC means, it in part kind of touches on what Prapat was saying, in that you've got a big country versus a small country. What the big country can do with its economy is going to be obviously very different to what the small country can do. You've got a country that has polluted more historically versus a country that has polluted less historically. So what the smaller country has to do in order to address climate change, they have to do something, but obviously it cannot be at the same level at which a country like the US is doing. A country like the US has to do more, presumably, for addressing climate change than what a country like Pakistan, for instance, might have to do. Similarly, a country that has polluted, and this is kind of CBDR, or at least the principle of CBDR, similarly, a country like the US, for instance, which has had longer historic emissions compared to, let's say, Malawi, as an example, Malawi doesn't have a history of having polluted, at least let's just say the countries around them, or contributed as significantly as the US to the global carbon budgets. So the principle is the polluter pays. So the one who's polluted the most ought to pay the most, right? These are some of the issues, though, that are now contentious, that kind of Prabhat was touching on, because all of these things have to kind of be discussed. There's a question of fairness there. There's a question of, again, CBDR, but all of this has to be kind of negotiated. One of the big issues, for instance, that we faced when we were at COP26 was that developed nations were pushing back against this idea of a loss and damage finance, because in the way in which it was being discussed, it was that wealthier nations have to provide more of this funding to the poorer nations. And the wealthier nations are saying, yes, but if we're framing this, particularly in the sense of reparations, as Prabhat was saying, so this historical component and that they owe a debt to society, then for them, their concern is, well, because our debt to society is so huge, we'll obviously have a very huge payment to make, which could essentially deplete some of their resources as countries. So this has been some of the pushback that we've seen, particularly from countries in the European Union and also some of the countries from the West. But the reality of the matter is, what the science has so clearly stated to us is that if climate change has been brought about by carbon emissions, or rather pollution, and we see that historically the biggest polluters are those who are obviously benefiting the most today, surely they should have a greater responsibility to then pay back, or rather to do more if it's not paid back. So it becomes a question of, how do we then get the language issues right? And this is where things are at international negotiation level. Last year, the subject of loss and damage got to a point where it was in the provisional text up until, I think, Prabhat, you can correct me if I'm wrong, up until the day before or the 2 days before the final text was supposed to be out on the second Friday. And the reason why it came out is because of the language issues, right? Because of this thing of US, as an example, having to pay reparations. They aren't in support of that idea, and others as well. So it puts us in a position where we have to say, but surely you guys have a responsibility to do more. So how then do we get you guys to do more and accept that you guys have to do more, because you guys are in part responsible for how it is that we've gotten here. But it doesn't completely absolve all nations from doing something, you see? So it's a very, and so this is from, at least from the CAN international space, this is probably one of the major issues that we've found as stumbling blocks when we engage with particularly different country negotiators, is that if we could frame it in a slightly different way, then perhaps it might gain traction. I agree with Prabhat when he says that because now we're seeing that there's flooding happening in Germany, there's flooding and droughts happening in Australia, there's fires happening in the US, that now we might be gaining some traction because obviously it's now beginning to impact particularly developed nations. But at the same time, you know, I mean, this whole thing is still being negotiated. And I think this is in part why Prabhat is saying it's going to take 3 years, is because there has to be an agreement at international diplomacy space to say, yes, we will do this part. Yes, we'll then contribute X amount. And yes, it will be, it should be provided to particularly developing nations first before developed nations. And this is just completely my own thoughts, by the way. Because they're the ones who are most impacted. They're the ones with the least ability to be able to respond to some of these impacts, more so than, for instance, what Norway might be able to do. So it's very much still under discussion. As CAN International, what we've been able to do is we've looked at some of the different options that have been put forth, for instance, by the G77 and China, and some other countries as well. And we've put some options on the table for how this particular loss and damage finance facility could look at. One of the major things, though, that remains in there is this principle of equity and justice. Equity in terms of definitely CBDR must be in there, definitely the polluter must pay principle. And then also that there's a greater responsibility that developed nations have to provide support to developing nations for damages incurred. But of course, all of this is still dependent on how well we can kind of build the text so that it can gain the proper support. The last thing that I want to touch on, which is also a little bit of a sticky issue, at least as I've engaged with some of my colleagues on the continent, particularly, is this issue around the insurance aspect. Because, you know, when you say something is an insurance, right? There's you saying, okay, if you take it in a very, very rudimentary sense, let's take household insurance or car insurance. You have to have you own the vehicle, you pay the premiums, right? Once something happens to your vehicle, you then have a right to claim because you've been paying premiums, isn't it? This is how insurance typically works. So how would it work in this particular instance? Is that, are we then saying that poorer countries also would then have to pay premiums in order for them to be able to claim back? But yet, if they then are paying these premiums, they're accepting a certain level of responsibility for their contribution to the climate change, right? So if we're going to go with that line of thought, then surely, again, this principle of the developed nations versus developing nations ought to have a bigger, differentiated but bigger role to play as a developing nation compared to, as a developed as compared to developing. So it is one of those things, and it kind of touches on that thing of historical responsibility when we push the insurance narrative. It's not to say that, you know, there's a good counter on there. It's just to say that these are the things that are emergent, and these are the things that we kind of need to talk about. Even locally, we need to kind of ask the state, for instance, what happens in an example where, and we came close to it in 2019 with Hurricane Ida. What happens in a situation where a hurricane comes through and wipes away half of our power stations in Mpumalanga? You know, what happens in that? Because it's going to affect everyone. We're already seeing, this morning I just got a notification that 5 power stations got impacted in South Africa, right? Which has resulted in load shedding again. So what happens if it's not as a result of sabotage, but as a result of an environmental thing or climate change thing? These are things that we need to be asking of ourselves, and we need to be asking of our state as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Sandro. Thank you so much for that. That was actually going to be my next question. So I'm going to get Prabhat to also expand on it. Prabhat, from the governance side, I think this conversation is important because so far it's been so obvious that, of course, we must have a loss and damage facility, but where's the holdup in it? And this gives us a proper appreciation of the politics and the political landscape that is then holding back the progression or the reality, the realization of this facility, which seems so obvious that we need. Considering if we're talking about, you know, those who've done the least should be the recipients. Africa, historically, we've only done 1% of the work that's been done. So we're possibly looking at bankrupting other countries. I know that their reservations are around the liability part. At which point do they say, okay, this is how much we're giving and this is where we draw the line? If we start by saying, okay, pay for the damage of Cyclone Idai, what's to say that's not going to become pay for the damage of this and this and this and this and this. And before we know it, all their GDP is being dedicated to paying for the effects of the climate crisis. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but you can appreciate the hesitation or reluctance from their perspective. Prabhat, the politics of loss and damage globally from a governance perspective.
I think before we get there, I think one important point that, I think if we agree, which I hope we agree, that the climate change is here, the impacts are happening, then it's at a certain level, it's also a futile discussion that who's going to pay, because somebody is going to pay whether we agree or not. So somebody is going to pay with their lives, right? If not with their money. So impacts are going to be here, and I think what we are through loss and damage negotiations are aiming for is a perfect solution to an imperfect world. And in absence of a perfect solution, I think we do need to carry on with imperfect approaches or solutions that we may have. So we can't wait for international community to agree on a loss and damage before starting to take steps domestically. So even whatever capacity we have, we may have to start responding to avert the loss and damage or address these concerns, but at the same time maintain pressure internationally that this is an issue that needs to be addressed systematically and responsibility needs to be fixed. So so we can't just say, oh, we'll wait for the world to agree on loss and damage and then we will come on with the humanitarian assistance and all. These things need to happen simultaneously, otherwise we will see the cost of inaction we will also notice locally. Yeah, so an example, in 2004, the eastern coast of India was hit by tsunami, very devastating tsunami, right? And a lot of people died in that. I don't even have numbers, but it was in thousands. But the Indian government from that point has learned, and there have been tsunamis or events on the coast, but over time it has created a system, which also speaks to some of the comments in the chat, that the local government is enabled, that in anticipation of these storms, that you already move the people away from coast, and that way so investing in communication infrastructure, that using phones to provide a message that this is approaching, you need to move away from these areas. So those simple things, we don't necessarily have to wait to avoid these kind of extreme damages, that because now you can invest in the satellite systems, etc. So you're more on top of how the cyclones, etc. are moving. So I think that's one. The global politics, I think I'm very worried in the terms of the global politics, because what we are seeing now is that the total breakdown of a system, of a global cooperation system, right? If you can't agree on on providing vaccines for all, in spite of all the discourse around vaccines for all, if we can't agree on how a war between Russia and Ukraine can be resolved, how are we going to agree on impacts which can be felt in 200 countries in a hypothetical case simultaneously also, right? The nature might vary. How are we going to address with such a complex issue? So I think that, to me, is calls for a bit of pragmatism, that while we wait and we work towards resolving this internationally, we need to not be complacent about it and start working domestically with whatever we can, and getting our house in order from national to local, so that as and when this opens up, it's resolved, we have channels. So we don't wait for international agreement before we start addressing national local dimension of the piece of the puzzle, right? So that's where I would weigh in. The global politics, I think, now that the climate change is impacting developed countries, so there is realization that that we need to address that. That's one good thing, even though it comes after a lot of cost, and it will see some movements, it will give some movements, but still I'm not very optimistic about countries suddenly flipping their stance. We may still need to find some compromise somewhere that, that this is what we need to do to get this thing rolling, and then build on that. So we might not have a situation where we have nothing to everything in just one COP, so that is not, I think that's a very unfair expectation, that we are putting too much load on one meeting where people are meeting after, I mean, especially you are operating in a context where countries are not trusting each other, right? The global system is on a verge of a collapse, essentially. So I think if we can get incremental gains at this COP, that will be great, and then use that to build on that over time. But at the same time, I think I continue to hammer this message. We have to domestically get our house in order, because we can't wait for other countries to agree that, and then hope for a miracle. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think I foresee that there will be contentious debate on this thing, and we might have a sense of deja vu in the last 2 days, where the text was in the the text on loss and damage was in the text, and then it was taken out. We might have those deja vu moments, unfortunately.
That would be really sad, especially because in Egypt, people aren't even allowed to protest. So if we had deja vu, no matter how upset we are, we wouldn't even be able to protest. And definitely on the point of incremental gains, I think just looking at the history of COP, you can see that it's just incremental gains. Every year you begin to chip at something, and maybe 3 years later, 5, sometimes 9 is when it becomes a reality. But to use your own words, where's the fairness in that? Where's the fairness in that? Someone else is going to pay with their life, and someone else is paying with money. Where's the fairness in that money versus life payment? So I'm now going to open up the floor to questions and answers. Thank you so much, Sizwe, for your comment. In the chat on what's happening in KZN and local solutions, and how we also need to embed climate resilience in how we respond while we're waiting for the facility to become a reality. And then looking over at the chat, I think Richard's question on negotiations, on the equity principle question, I think that one we've answered. And then we've got a question from Simpilo: what is South Africa doing to address loss and damage such as floods, increase in heat and droughts? And I think that speaks to the comment that Sizwe shared, that we're here now, what is happening at present, pre-loss and damage facility. If anyone would like to make a comment, please do put your hand up, but you'd have to keep it really short and succinct to give as many people as we can a chance to respond. Pravat? Not respond, a chance to ask and comment. Pravat?
Yeah, just on that question by Simfilo, that what is South Africa doing? So floods, increase in heat and droughts, in terms of language, these are climate impacts. What happens because of them, that will be categorized as loss and damage. So I think just for our clarity, we need to distinguish between what is impact, what is loss and damage. So what these events do, that will be categorized as loss and damage. So I think what South Africa is doing, I think that goes back to what I'm suggesting, that, while we wait for international puzzle to resolve, we need to start moving on these issues and start really investing in the disaster management and dimensions of these things. Thanks.
And thanks, Pravat. Do you have anything to add, Thando?
Yeah, just that point as well. I think, look, disaster hasn't been something new to the South African landscape, right? There have been a few that one could think of in the recent years, but definitely we could say in the last, let's say, 3 to 5 years, other than the obvious increase in environmental disasters and the like, I think the KZN flooding really brought to bear the state of readiness that we have as a state to addressing environmental disasters, right, or climate disasters, if you will. And I agree with the point about South Africa needs to kind of pull up its socks, as it were, to be in a state of readiness and not necessarily wait for the international community first to kind of get the footing right. And I think in order to get us to that point, I do think it will require particularly pressure from the bottom more so, because, look, this is the 28th meeting, 27th meeting, right? So it's 27 years at least. And I agree and I accept the incremental progress, although one must be frank and say the impact on happening at an incremental level, right? Similarly to the point that Prabhat is making about, who pays, one is paying with their lives, other one is paying with money. We're talking about things that are actually happening. We're talking about things that are actually happening. Pakistan is just exactly that. Nigeria is exactly that. KZN is exactly that. People are paying with their lives. What isn't yet coming to the party is the second part of the conversation, which is where's the money going to come from? So it is one of those things where I think for me personally, pressure from the bottom is definitely what is going to be needed, at least at a domestic level, to try and really encourage this thing. And lessons from KZN, I think, should be learned there. And to then, if I could just jump, Chair, through you to answer Bertha's question, I think at a grassroots level, a technical conversation is not necessary. I don't think it's going to yield any fruit. But I think at a grassroots level, people can tell you what they think, or it is how they think they would need help should a KZN happen in their area. We then begin to get real inputs around what could be technically feasible through us and our organizations when we get some of this understanding around what it is that people are looking for. Because already we're going through, Eastern Cape is going through, specifically Kabeja or Port Elizabeth, however you use the term, has gone past its day zero for water. I don't know how they're surviving now, but they're making a plan for water. So even there, we could be speaking to those communities to find out what are the different options. And then the question becomes, how do we then scale up some of these solutions? And then at a national level, provide some kind of mechanism or facility which will allow us to be able to do so. It does require political will. And the reason why, and the only thing that will make political will move is when they see numbers and when they see action from numbers. So I do think it is, at least at a domestic level, it is required, it does require quite a bit of action from the bottom. Yeah, I think let me leave it there. Let me leave it there for now. Thanks, Pato.
Thanks. I think when you bring in the day zero in Kabeja, and then when we hear these stories, we hear the celebration of resilience. I think we see it a lot as well in terms of African women having to live through certain climate crises and the like. And the thing of celebrating resilience, when it's a thing of we're celebrating resilience for trauma that people shouldn't have even had to go through in the first place. But that's a sidebar. Prabhat, would you like to add to Bertha's question on how do we vehicle such messages or create rooms like these on the grassroots level? So maybe what the role of grassroots level is in terms of advocating for loss and damage, and yeah, their role, and how do we bring them into the conversation?
Yeah, so just briefly, I see that there's YOLO has hand up. So
yeah, we're just going to do the Q&A and then we'll bring YOLO in. YOLO, your hand is noted.
So I think when you're talking of resilience, I think part of what you're saying is, of course, in effect, there is something called willful resilience that, and something called forced resilience. And I see we are celebrating the examples of forced resilience, which nobody necessarily want to be in that situation. But I think that there's a bit of a perverse dimension to when we start celebrating, there's the resilience, not the act of resilience, but to celebrate them in a way, not noticing that, this could have been avoided, as you're saying, right? So, but the willful resilience, if you were to say, and being proactive, that saying that, look, this is coming, we need to start gearing up already. I think I would like to see more examples of that. And I think that's where the question that Bertha raised, that, that could be important. The conversation from the ground level should hold both international community into account, but also the national government into account, that, look, we had these plans for cities in place, the resilient cities in place. Why were they not effective? Right? That's an important conversation. Does that mean that these plans are as good as paper tigers, or are they actually going to do anything? And so I think there's the degree of accountability. There's an international accountability, but also national and local. That we are not here. We don't want policies and plans as ornaments. We want them to actually deliver something. And if they are not, we need to have a conversation why that's not happening.
And thanks for also bringing in accountability, which has been something that has been quite lacking to some degree so far in our climate action nationally and globally. So I'm going to connect the next two questions, the one from Richard on, given that South Africa has high responsibility emissions and also high vulnerability and is a middle income country, but with high inequality, should we not be looking at a loss and damage facility at national level? And that question connects to Misha's question that reads, in terms of differentiated responsibility, how does South Africa navigate this, since South Africa is a developing nation, but also at the same time also contributes significantly to climate change currently as the 12th, 13th largest emitter? South Africa playing both roles, the bad guy and the good guy. How do we balance that? Pravat, would you like to go first, and then Thando?
Yeah, I think that's it. So a couple of other points. South Africa might be the top 2 or top 3 emitters amongst the African countries, right? Possibly the biggest emitter. It's also the only African country in the G20 constellation. So we have some responsibility. If we are saying that, we also need to lead by example. So, so while we hold, developed countries to account, we also need to be self-reflective and say, look, we can't be having these conversations while being one of the most coal-intensive economy, right? And that's where it goes back full circle and goes to the mitigation question, that if we are honest about this conversation, then we need to really, really get away from our coal addiction. And really need to think about, these as a package, that not in isolation, but that, how do we address them simultaneously and achieve these objectives simultaneously? So yeah, so I think, we can't just be play the role of the victim here. We also need to exercise agency and take, measures constructively that we can do at our own level. Yeah.
Definitely, Prabhat. I think one of, so I'm going to go to Thando, and then after Thando, Yolo will come to your question or comment. But when you talk about South Africa's, well, our coal addiction, I think South Africa probably has one of my favorite responses when it comes to responding to keep your coal in the ground. They're just like, you used your resources, so pay us to keep ours in the ground. I think that is a strategy. And it seems to be serving the people and the country quite well. Thando, and then we'll come over to you, Yolo.
I don't know if it's worked serving the country quite well. Just to kind of push back on you, but yeah, I have heard that as well. Look, I think from my perspective, right, I think South Africa is actually doing, from a leadership role, is doing all right. They could always do better, and I think they must do better. But they're not doing so bad. I say this because, I've come to appreciate the role that South Africa plays geopolitically, and at a space like COP, we get to see it unfold. So yes, we have probably the largest historical, we are the largest historical emitter on the continent. To that end, we do provide some kind of a leadership role on the continent. So to be specific, look, we're there's the Africa Group of Negotiators, there's the least developed countries. These are political groupings or blocks, if you will, that we are part of at the UNFCCC, wherein South Africa, as it negotiates, is also negotiating in part of. There's also the basics as well, and the G77 plus China, but specifically looking at Africa, right? So in there, we're playing quite a strong role when it comes to some of these negotiations. Even when you look at G77 plus China and basics, when South Africa is negotiating in those blocks, they're negotiating not only on their behalf, but on behalf of the continent. So there's a certain responsibility that has already been played there, particularly when it comes to what kind of interventions would be required at a national and a regional level as well. I do think as well, on the continent, outside of the fact that, yes, we definitely have to move away from coal as a country and as a globe, what we're seeing now is that, this emergence of what has happened in Russia and Ukraine has brought about this issue of sovereign states. The idea of the sovereign state was kind of diminishing for a long time, but now it's kind of resurfacing again, and specifically when it looks at energy sovereignty, right? So the ability for a country to determine what kind of energy it needs and how it's going to provide for it. So it goes back to this point that you're making, that we've got coal, we're going to use it. Now, in that sense, we're not playing the kind of leadership role that we need to play there. If, for instance, we look at where South Africa stands today in terms of its coal infrastructure, its the impacts that coal has had on our environment, on our health, particularly in a place like Malanga, for instance, we cannot be wanting to advocate for that for other countries, particularly the sub-Saharan Africa. I think as a share of the globe, sub-Saharan Africa probably contributes less than 10% of global emissions, right? We are already closer than any other region on the subject of net zero, and at least so we have a competitive advantage there. So in my view, we ought to be playing more of a role to try and move away from coal and spreading our energy mix far wider beyond that of fossil fuels, so that we can actually get to a point where we kind of don't get countries locked into white elephants, which will be coal-fired power stations, nuclear power stations in the future. So there is that element. So there is a role that's being played, but it definitely needs to get strengthened. And specifically, this issue of pushing on making sure that those poorest nations have support from the wealthier nations to be able to achieve, in part, their NDCs, for instance, and other objectives that they have to address the issues of climate change. I hope I answered that.
Thanks, Tando. So from a South Africa success angle, I mean, currently no one is getting money, climate finance like South Africa in Africa. When we look at JET-P, we look at the recent German commitment, you're clearly doing something right. I'm not saying it's perfect, but you're doing something right. And on the contribution of Sub-Saharan Africa, we are at present we're contributing about 3% emissions to the global emissions. Yolo Bakumo Smith, thank you so much for your patience. Please do unmute and share your question or comment.
Hello, everyone. This is Yolo from Nigeria. Okay, so I have two questions. One is, I need in concrete terms, what is South Africa's position going to COP27? Because one, we can't be totally dependent on aid and loss and damage claim. That's not sustainable. That's the honest truth. We must find a way to have a robust plan. Of course, intra-continental trade should be more strong and robust to accommodate this strain on our economy. That's one. Secondly, after these discussions, framework and conferences, solutions will be those solutions, of course, and when implemented, I've observed, because as a social entrepreneur in the local space, there's a big divide, there's a big gap between those solutions and reality. So how do we get local actors to be part of this discussion? And because it's more or less one size fits all, and that's not the actual case in reality. So how do we get unique ideas, indigenous ideas to be on the table, to get those that will work? Because we are the victims. We know what actually works and what doesn't work. So how do we get those local actors to be part of the conversation? Thank you.
Thanks, Yolo. I think if I got that right, so SA strategy going to COP27, considering that we can't only survive this through grants and local actors. How are we bringing on local actors? How are we bringing new actors to the table? How are we bringing more diversified voices to the table in the conversation? Tando and then Prabhat. Thank you for that question, Yolo. And thanks for joining us all the way from Nigeria. We are international, guys. Tando?
Thanks, Bato, and thanks, Yolo, for your question. So let me answer the easy one first, which is, what is South Africa's position? And to be fair, I'll keep the position to just loss and damage, because we obviously have positions on several things. The stated position of South Africa is that they're going to advance the financial arrangements for loss and damage. What that means is two things. Number one, they're in support of the development of the loss and damage finance facility. They're not necessarily going to push on it as loudly as others may, but they are in support of that action and objective. What they are pushing on for certain is the operationalization of the SNLD, which is Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, because it does provide, as I said, this institutional home that would allow for the finance facility and any other actions relative to loss and damage to then be implemented. Part of what the Santiago Network seeks to do, I believe, is to also get certain parties or countries to be contributors to that fund. So South Africa would be one of those contributors to that fund once things begin to be operationalized. So this was the last stated objective that they had. So I'll leave it there. Yeah, sorry, they also speak on addressing the multiple options. Just to quickly answer the second one, local actions. Look, that one is not as easy as one would want it to be, because for all the reasons that you see, Prabhat and I kind of going back and forth on the subject, is that number one, is still very much in discussions at the international diplomacy space, right? It's somewhat volatile in that it could be, although we are pushing to make sure that it stays on the agenda, it could be removed off the agenda. And so what does that mean in terms of actions? But also locally, I don't think it should be at a technical point or technical perspective. For me, the question at a local level should always be, how do we respond to the issues that we're seeing happening? In a case like Nigeria, it's a very simple question, and not easy, but simple question. How do we avoid the flooding that happened in Nigeria from happening again? Or how do we rebuild our economy following the floods that we've just witnessed in Nigeria? I think those two questions will then begin to start the ball rolling on possible ideas that one could then begin to implement. And then, as I said earlier, scale those ideas upwards and see the level of government involvement and support to implement some kind of institutional capacity to respond to those. Thanks, Pato.
Thanks, Sando. Prabhat, I'm going to ask you to be a bit brief because we're quick running out of time.
Sure, but Pato, just quickly to your point, which you mentioned, there are two statements which come to my mind. We didn't get out of the Stone Age for the lack of stone. And the second, and I need to be a bit, I apologize if I'm come across as insensitive. If somebody is showing suicidal tendencies, then I don't think the negotiation is the way to go. They need counseling. And I think that's the example that you gave. So I think I would say that in that case, South Africa need counseling, and maybe JETP is the counseling, kind of counseling we're talking about. And I think on South Africa's negotiating position, look, in negotiations, the countries, when they enter these negotiations, they're not going to put all their cards on the table. So it's it might be all intention for South Africa to prioritize loss and damage, but they have to play this carefully. So I will leave it at that. Thando, I think Thando has ably responded to that already. I see, Pato, your screen has frozen. Would you want me to respond to questions by Clive? I think Thando.
I think you can go for it, Prabhat.
Yeah. So Clive, very briefly on your questions about global loss and damage limited to funding governments directly. Pato, sorry, I'm just responding to Clive's questions and that quickly. I think, Clive, if this has to be managed, I think countries will have to make some national interface, but the funding would essentially flow to governments. That's how I see it. And otherwise, it will be very difficult to keep track of where the money is going, and we might see some cases of fraud, etc., and we wouldn't really know where the money is going. So in terms of establishing accountability governance, we might only see the nodes happening there. And on the question of imposing higher export taxes on coal and other exported fuels, I think it's encouraging to see that the fossil fuel phase down language is at least now in the UNFCCC language. But this language might come, and then it will raise further complications for South Africa. So I think it makes the case that South Africa needs to be much more proactive on that. And then Richard has raised the interesting questions, which I would be very keen to take that offline with Richard. That I don't think we have enough time on that.
I would be quite keen to also be a fly on the wall of that discussion, because that is a really interesting one about legitimizing illegitimate spaces. Tando, anything for Clive? If there's nothing pressing, do feel free to just. Great. My last question for you as we close, we're going to COP. We're going to COP 27. It's being termed the African COP. We want loss and damage. I think over the past hour and a half, we've made a strong case for why we need loss and damage. With us today, we've got media, we've got social entrepreneurs, we've got civil society, we've got gender activists, we've got grassroots movements and community-based organizations. As we go to COP27, what should we be taking there? RE COP27. So these would be your last words. Tando and then Prabhat. I'll give you 1 minute each.
1 minute. Impacts. I think we need to put a face on the impacts that are happening. Much of this conversation is very abstract. Much of it is very technical, as I keep repeating. We're talking about things that will happen, almost discounting to some extent the things that are happening, the things that happened. There are people who are the start and stop of everything that we're currently discussing. And I think going to COP27, we already go in there with the science that says Africa is the most impacted, South Africa is heating at twice the global average and so on. There are people that are impacted by these things. Can we then bring the faces of those people, the voices of those people, to a space where otherwise there would not be, and then use that as a motivation to really get action on the ground and leave it from an abstract conversation, if you will. Thanks.
Impacts for action on the ground. Prabhat?
I think we need to bring in youth much more strongly in this space, not as tokens, but actually as prominent voices in this space. But at the same time, acknowledging that the UNFCCC space has not just been a blah, blah, blah over years, that the geopolitics and negotiations are complex space, and each country comes with its own politics. So, recognizing that, but being an agent of change, agent of force, and strengthening the hands of those who really want to move this agenda forward. I think youth need to, engage both aggressively, but constructively also.
Okay, let's engage youth, both aggressively, but definitely productively. Thank you so much, Tando and Prabhat, for today. I've really enjoyed today's conversation. I've learned so much from it. Thank you to our audience. And I think the main thing that has really stuck out for me, the line that keeps playing in my head, it was from you, Prabhat. Someone is going to pay with their lives, if not with their money. And I think we need to remember this as we have the loss and damage conversations and appreciate the political landscape they're happening on. And with that, we come to the end of our webinar. To the audience, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for honoring our invitation and being a part of a very lively chat. The chat was quite lively there, the Q&A section. Thank you everyone for taking part. Tando, Prabhat, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And from me, it's just been a pleasure. And with that, my name is Batu Kilisite. I've been your moderator today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Good afternoon.